Hello and welcome to Module 6, How to Write Effective Details Paragraphs. So let's look at what we're going to do in this module. We're going to review the basic paragraph structure because that's very important. We're going to look at what the difference is between an overview and the details paragraphs. We're going to look at the golden rules, some rules that you must follow in order to write good details paragraphs. How to write details for graphs that go over time. And how to write details for comparative graphs when we're comparing two things. And finally, we're going to look at how to group data together in our details paragraphs logically. So let's just review the structure for any Task 1 question. So first, it's just one sentence, it's your introduction. Then you write two sentences for your overview, and then you get into the details paragraph when you start talking about data and start describing things in much more detail. And there are two paragraphs here, and there's one thing I want you to note. I have put 3 to 4 sentences for each of these. However, my sentences are quite long. I can write very long, complex sentences. So some of mine might only be 2 sentences. So if you see me writing a details paragraph that's only 2 sentences long, it probably means yours will be 3 or 4 sentences. So don't worry about that if I write 2. So today we're going to focus just on this, how to write the details. And this will be the majority of your essay. So it will, where you'll get a lot of marks if you write good details paragraphs. What's the difference between an overview and details paragraphs? So the overview is simply the main ideas described very, very generally. So it's the big picture as we talked about before. There is no data. You're just describing the main trends or the biggest differences. The details paragraph describes these main ideas in more detail. So what you do is you take your main ideas from the overview and you describe them in much more detail using data. So for example, important changes, numbers, differences, comparisons, these types of things. So what I want you to do is just think about an overview of my day. I'm going to tell you what I normally do every day, and this will be like my overview. And then I'm going to go into much more detail. These will be like my details paragraphs. So normally I work out, I exercise in the morning, and then I work, and then I spend time with my family. So those are the 3 main things that I do on a normal day. This is an overview of my day. But if we wanted to talk about these in more detail, these would be my details paragraphs. I work out by going to the gym, lifting weights, and going to the swimming pool. I then write a blog post, make a video, answer emails, and correct some IELTS tests. And then I took my son shopping, and in the evening we played football, and I read him a story before he went to bed. So you can see the difference between my day in overview, just 3 things, general things with no detail, and then in detail I'm adding in much more things, talking about things in much more detail. So this is a good way to think about the difference between an overview and details paragraphs. So here are some golden rules that you must follow when writing details paragraphs. First, you do not describe every single piece of data. You do not include every single number. If you do that, 1, you'll run out of time, and 2, you will write about irrelevant things. Remember that the question only asks you to report key features, not every single piece of data. So you only report the most important data. Make sure your data is accurate. This is a very, very common mistake. Students write the data but they don't check it properly, and the data is actually inaccurate. So always check to make sure it is accurate. Make sure you actually mention data. Lots of people think they're going into much more detail and they start describing things in more detail, but they don't actually support any of this with data from the graph, so a percentage or a number or something like that. So make sure every sentence you write has some sort of data in your details paragraph. So in your details paragraph, every sentence should have at least 1 piece of data, if not more. You have to group together data logically. And we're going to be looking at how to do that in more detail at the end of this module. So you just have to order your data in a way that makes sense. And the last one is make comparisons when relevant. So you don't have to find comparisons everywhere, only when it's relevant to do so. For example, if you had one value A is 50% and the other value B is 25%, you could say that A is double what B is. That would be a relevant comparison. But don't spend your whole time looking for comparisons that aren't there. Only make them when they're relevant. So describing data over time. You've seen a few of these already in this course. It's when you have a line graph or a bar chart that has a start date and an end date. So the main goal is to show the examiner that you understand the details and you can report them clearly. So this is the main goal for any details paragraph, is to show the examiner that you clearly understand what's happening and that you can tell him or her about it clearly. In the overview, you describe the data from start to finish, i.e. a general trend. But we're not going to do that again. We've already done that in the overview. In the details paragraphs, you're going to describe the data in smaller parts. So let's look at what this means practically. Let's look at a real example. So if we take burglary, in the overview, we just described this data. Okay, we described it from this point to this point, very generally. So in general, it decreases. But in the details paragraph, we're going to look at it in much more detail. So we're going to break it up into smaller pieces. So what we're going to do is we're first going to comment on this, a smaller piece. Then we would comment on this smaller piece, comment on this smaller piece, and comment on this smaller piece. So instead of commenting on the general trend over time from 2003 to 2012, do we just look logically at what happens and break it into more logical pieces? So let's look at what I wrote for the details paragraph for that graph. The number of burglaries rose slightly to around 3,750 in 2004 and then dropped sharply over the next 4 years to just above 1,000. Burglaries saw a slight increase in 2005 to just below 1,500 and then remains relatively stable at around this level until the end of the period. I've broken this up into 2 paragraphs, but in your answer it would be in 1 paragraph. I just wanted to make it clear. So the number of burglaries rose slightly to around 3,750 in 2004. So this is our first thing that we talk about. And then, this is our second thing. Then it dropped sharply over the next 4 years to just above 1,000. So that's our second thing that we're talking about. Then the third thing, burglaries saw a slight increase in 2005 to just below 1,500. And then the last thing that we're going to look at is then remained relatively stable at around this level until the end of the period. So let's do the same thing again with car theft. So car theft, we're not going to talk about the value from 2003 to 2012. We're going to break it up into into smaller pieces. So the most logical way to do that is to describe this and then to describe this. And if we put that into a paragraph, the number of car thefts fluctuated slightly between the start of the period until 2009 at between roughly 2,300 and just above 2,000. So that is our first thing that we're going to talk about. That's the number 1. It then increases steadily to its final level of approximately 2,800 in 2012. So this is our second thing. So 2 things that we looked at before. This is our first sentence, and this is our second sentence. So now we're going to stop looking at graphs over time, and we're going to look at graphs and charts which either have no date or just compare 1 or 2 dates. so they're not over time. Here we take the most important features from the overview and we describe them in more detail using data. So we use data to support our ideas. So let's look at a good and a bad example. Australia has the highest percentage of people living on the coast than any other country. So do you think this is a good or a bad example? This is a bad example, and the main reason is there is no data. Okay, this is something that you would probably write in your overview maybe, but not in your details paragraph because it's not supported by data. With 72%, Australia has the highest percentage of people living on the coast than any other country. So you'll see the difference is just with 72%. Because we've supported the idea with data, that is a good sentence for our details paragraph. Alright, let's look at two different questions that show us how to compare data. So first we're going to look at this pie chart, and in the overview we said there were three main reasons, and overgrazing was the biggest reason. So we need to add detail to that. Overgrazing, overcultivation and deforestation make up the vast majority of causes of land degradation. So vast majority is, it's not a percentage, it's not a number, but it is data. The vast majority means very, 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 very high. Animals eating too much grass is the top reason with just over a third. So the data there is just over a third. I didn't want to repeat the percentage, and I want to show the examiner that I can use proportions instead of just repeating the percentage. So I've used just over a third instead of 35%. Cutting down too many trees is second with just under a third. And producing too many crops is the second last reason with just over a quarter. So underlined is my data. Just over a third, just under a third, and just over a quarter. There's some other things I want you to think about. I've changed overgrazing to animals eating too much grass, and I've changed deforestation to cutting down too many trees. And I've changed overcultivation to producing too many crops. So I've just varied my language a little bit. And I've done that just by defining what deforestation, what overcultivation and overgrazing means. Next, so that is our paragraph done for causes of land degradation, the pie chart. So we need to move on to this. And in our overview, we discussed this. We said the total land degraded, Europe had the biggest figure. So we need to talk in detail a bit more about that. Europe has over twice as much degraded land than Oceania, with 23% and 13% respectively. So I have mentioned the number one reason and the number two reason, and I have made a comparison, over twice as much. And something very important, that's why I have put it in red, respectively. This means that when we've mentioned Europe and then we've mentioned Oceania, if we say with 23% and with 13% respectively means that this is 23 and Oceania is 13. So it's just a better way to express that than saying Europe has over twice as much degraded land, its degraded land is 23% than Oceania, and its degraded land is 13%. That's just too long and it's not very sophisticated. So get used to using this respectively. But if we look at this is just one sentence. This isn't long enough for a details paragraph. Therefore, we need to go back and look at our graph and get more details. So if we look at this, we've only really discussed this. We haven't discussed any of this. However, there are lots and lots of numbers here. Too many numbers for us to in one paragraph. There's 9 different numbers. So what we need to do first is think about the purpose. So what is the purpose of this box? It's to show the difference between the 3 areas and the 3 reasons. So we need to look for significant data. So North America, its main reason is overcultivation. Europe, its main reason is deforestation, and overgrazing, it's the main reason for Oceania. So we can see that there are 3 different reasons for each country. Each country has a different main reason. So what we do is we just report this, we report this, and we report this. And we don't worry about any of the other data. It's not relevant, it's not important. In Oceania, overgrazing is the #1 reason with 11.3%, while deforestation is the main cause with 9.8% in Europe. Finally, in North America, overcultivation is the primary cause with 3.3%. So you'll notice that my data is here, here, and here. And you'll notice that I've varied my language a little bit. #1 reason, main cause, primary cause. So I varied my language a little bit to show the examiner that I have a wide-ranging vocabulary. Now let's move on to looking at this one. So this was our 4 pie charts, which compared Italy and Yemen, their ages, and it compared 2000 with the future in 2050. So if you remember the overview we compared Yemen and Italy first, and we said that Yemen had a younger population than Italy, and then we compared the past with the future, and we said both countries were going to get older. So what we need to do is we need to take those 2 general trends and add data to them, talk about them in much more detail. In 2000, over half of the population of Yemen were between 0 and 14 years old. But in Italy, this figure was much lower at just 14.3%. Just under half of Yemen's population was between 15 and 59, and only a small minority of 3.6% were 60 or over. In contrast with Italy, where 14.3% were 60 or over. So what I've done here is I've taken the general thing that I've put in the overview, which is Yemen has a younger population than Italy, and I've just added data to that to prove that theory that I've put in my overview. So the next thing we need to do, now that we have compared Yemen and Italy in the year 2000, we need to compare both Yemen and Italy 2000 to 2050. So in the overview I said both countries will get older in 2050. They will have an older population in 2050 compared to 2000. So what I need to do is take data from the pie chart and I need to put that into my details paragraph. And here it is. Yemen's population is projected to change with a rise of 11% in people aged between 15 and 59, and an increase of over 2% in people over 59. The percentage of people in Italy under 15 is expected to fall by over 3%, and the proportion of people over 59 is predicted to nearly double. So as you can see, I've compared the two, 2000 and 2050 for both countries, and I've just looked at the differences between those 2 values. So instead of just quoting directly, I've said a rise of 11%. That's the difference between 2000 and 2050. Increase of over 2%. That's the difference between the 2 figures. Fall by over 3%. And nearly double. Okay, so I've made comparisons between the first date and the future date in those 4 parts. So now let's move on to grouping, how to group our data together logically. So the most logical way for a graph over time is normally by category. So if you have 2 categories, it would be logical just to discuss one in one details paragraph and the other in another details paragraph. If you had 4 categories, you would discuss 2 of them in one details paragraph and the other 2 in a different details paragraph. If 2 graphs, it will normally be 1 graph in one details paragraph and then the other in the other details paragraph. For comparison graphs, it will normally depend on the purpose. You'll have to think about the purpose. What are they doing? So for this one, we have 3 categories: burglary, car theft, and robbery. And robbery is a little bit different because it doesn't do much. It kind of just stays the same. There isn't big changes in that. So I'm going to describe this in one paragraph, and then I'm going to describe car theft and burglary in the other details paragraph. So the overall structure will look like this. First paragraph introduction, second paragraph overview, and then the details will be burglary and car theft in one and robbery in the other. If we were to look at this, there are two different graphs. There's a table and there's a pie chart. Therefore, we just discuss one in one details paragraph and the other in another details paragraph. So the grouping would look like this. Pie chart in one details paragraph and table in the other. For this is a little bit more complicated because it is a comparison, okay? And there's 4 different charts. So some people might make the big mistake of looking at this and seeing Italy and Yemen. And they might think, I'll just write one paragraph for Italy and one paragraph for Yemen. That is a mistake. That's not a very logical thing to do because you haven't thought of the purpose. What is the purpose of this? The purpose is to compare Yemen and Italy in 2000 and 2000, and to compare past, so 2000 and 2050. So the most logical thing to do is have one graph that compares Yemen and Italy in the past, 2000, and then one paragraph that compares the two dates, 2000 and 2050, for both countries. So the grouping is going to look like this. Purpose number 1, compare Italy and Yemen. Purpose number 2, compare 2000 and 2050. So let's review what we did in this module. In this module, we looked at what the difference is between an overview and a details paragraph. An overview is you're going to talk very generally about the most important data. The details paragraph is where you take those important things and you support them with data. You describe them in detail. We looked at the golden rules, the things that you should and shouldn't do in order to write a good details paragraph. We looked at writing details for graphs over time. The key to writing details paragraphs for graphs over time is to break up the lines into smaller pieces and describe them. We looked at writing details for comparative graphs. And the key there is to think about the purpose. What are they comparing? And then you can describe it in more detail. And we looked at grouping together data logically for 3 different types of graphs. Now we're going to move on to step-by-step lessons for all of the different questions. So the next lesson, we're going to have a step-by-step lesson on writing an answer for a line graph and a bar chart. I hope you find this lesson useful, and I'll see you in Module 7. Thank you. Goodbye.